Welcome to MyLife, Chassidus Applied, episode 10. Due to recent tragic events, I'm going to dedicate this episode primarily to topics that relate to that. Many questions have come in, very personal, very difficult, but in the spirit of applied Chassidus, we need to address every possible topic, especially ones that hit home and affect us so deeply, and must include myself personally as well, and family, and so on. So let me just put it in the words of some of the writers, and then try to address it to the best of my ability. Question. Facing tragedy. With all the wonderful stuff you've been doing with MyLife, Chassidus Applied, can you please take some time to address the heart-wrenching traumas our community has faced this year, especially the most recent one of a young mother leaving 8 children behind, a grieving husband, parents, family, and all of us who have been so deeply touched by it. In addition to all the recent tragedies in our families, in our communities, including Chabad Shluchim, emissaries. What is God thinking? What are we to do about it? Another rephrased similar question, maybe it's time to finally tackle the big one. Why do bad things happen to good people? There's so much to talk about from this perspective, from the big picture to the collective events in Jewish history, to the small one, to the person himself who experiences, to survivors or extended acquaintances. Please address this issue. And one more, can't read them all, so I just selected a few that really capture it poignantly. When I first came to Chassidus, I remember how liberated and inspired I felt upon learning the concept of Hashgacha Pratis. Every single detail has divine purpose. Nothing is for naught, and that one day we will understand how every occurrence since creation has been for the good. I realize the question to follow is not a new one, yet I'm still unsure of the best answer and guidance. How does one approach and teach this concept to a person who's been victim to a personal tragedy? In my case personally, my mother, I'm not going to read in detail, was violated as a teenager. She does not know that I know. I see clearly how this has cast a cloud over everything in her life. I dream of how uplifted she could be if she only incorporated Chassidus into her life. But often when I try to be positive and share what I've learned, a voice inside holds me back and asks, how can I present such a concept to someone who endured such torture? I appreciate your time and caring guidance. And many more, truly many more questions. And I'm sure many have not written questions who have them inside their hearts. And as I say again, I reiterate, I myself have been deeply impacted by it personally. So it's not easy to speak about, but as the Frierdiker Rebbe once said, it's difficult to speak, but it's even more difficult to be silent. And if Chassidus and Torah is needed at any time, this is when it's needed most, in the darkest moments, in tragic moments, in moments where we're completely at loss to explain, to understand, to ourselves, to our children. And yet, we speak. So whatever I'm going to be saying now, I hope in all the episodes of my life, but especially when it comes to a topic like this, because of its sensitivity and its sheer inability to fathom the bigger plan, is primarily taken from the words of the Rebbe, from Chassidus, trying to incorporate it together from different letters, from different talks, and Maimorim and so on. And I'll be quoting them specifically as we go. Let me just begin with the most important thing of all. At the end of the day, after all explanations, after all discussions, there really is no answer. Remember, questions and answers are in the domain of the intellect. Intellect itself is a creation of God's. So how can God be bound by intellect that He created? A brilliant mind cannot speak to a bleeding heart. And I want to divide the discussion here into 2 parts. One, which is the harder difficult issue to address, is to people who've suffered directly, family, individuals, children, and so on, who directly impacted. And then to the rest of us who are witnesses to it, who want to share something, who want to show compassion. What do we do? And it's really almost two different types of responses, even though fundamentally they come from the same place. But obviously, in every situation, you have to address it with the proper sensitivity. So the first and most important thing is this. We're not looking for explanations and answers. We're not looking for rationalizations and justifications. The pain is deep, and no answer in the world will explain not the Holocaust and not individual Holocausts. Every tragedy is a tragedy, a loss is a loss, and the finality of death is something that the human being can simply not contain and tolerate. And this is not meant to be an evasive statement. This itself is meant to give strength. You'll see in countless letters when the Rebbe addresses this topic, he begins with that, by saying we cannot understand God's plan. We cannot understand God's goodness. We cannot understand it. And many people seem to feel that that may be like an evasive statement, God forbid. Not at all. It's the truest statement you can expect in life. Life is not necessarily rational. As God told Job, when he asked him that big question, why do good people suffer? And why do wicked prosper? God said to him, and I'm paraphrasing, he said to him, were you there when I created heaven and earth that you asked me this question? That wasn't meant to pull rank and say you're not God. It was meant, do you understand the plan? Were you there at the beginning? You asked me about death. Do you know why there's life? You asked me about pain. Do you know why there's joy? You asked me about existence. Do you know why there is existence? You asked me about the end. Do you know why there's the beginning? In other words, it's all part of the bigger picture of understanding existence itself, because if God had not created existence as we have it, there'd be no pain, there'd be no loss, there'd be no death. So when you go into that level, you're talking about a completely different domain. And sadly, tragically, we're faced with, in a collision way, face to face, when a sad event and tragic event happens. And this is meant to help us to relate to an experience that's beyond us as humans. This is not an answer, not an explanation. So when you're dealing with someone that's had a tragic event, we have to do what one of the Rebbes once said, I have no answers for you, but I can cry with you. And that may be the best answer, quote unquote answer, because that gives strength. Because at the end of the day, what we need is empowerment and strength and how to forge ahead. Not necessarily some mathematical answer, not necessarily some profound equation. So in all the letters, it always begins with that. And yet some will say, 1 second, aren't there explanations given about that maybe death is due to sin, and the idea of Yuridat Seirach Aliyah and descent for the greater ascent? Yes, that's all nice and fine. Once you get beyond the main point, that sensitivity that things are simply unfathomable. And yet, we learn to forge ahead. I want to just quote, the Rebbe brings it sometimes in different sichos, but it's from the Tzemach Tzedek, in Eira Teira, Maseh, page 1391. And he says that this is why we ask in the prayer, we say, B'rachamecha Rabbim, we ask God's tremendous, abundant compassions, that you should give us the joy and the pleasure without the Yisurim, without the oppression. That even though there are all these explanations, how on the deepest darkness lies the greatest light, and how when God's deepest love is what elicits and reveals the deepest pain, the deepest difficulties, reveal the deepest love. The explanations in chapter 26 in Tanya, and the Rebbe brings in also from Ageres HaKedesh, section 11, section 21 rather, that after all, he says, we still ask God, because when a father looks at a child and sees them suffering, mischaret al yisurim, he regrets having to put his child through something like that. Af shehem kedei l'saken ben ki kol yochel, because God is all invincible. He's able to do anything. Shaloya yedei yisurim, and that's why we ask, you can do it a different way. So after you set it up a certain way, fine, but you can set it up a different way. And that's a critical component. That explanations, they come afterwards once you establish that God set up a certain system, but he could have set up a different system. Why does a mother have to be grieving over her daughter while she's also grieving over her mother with the same name that passed away at the same age? Why do 8 children have to be orphaned and now change the entire destiny of their life? For what? What did they do wrong? There's no answer to this question. And we have to simply accept that. And this doesn't mean we sit down and we ignore it. Because at the end of the day, think of it this way, using an analogy. There are three options. You can cry and cry and cry and never stop crying. If you're constantly aware of the initial shock and the memory doesn't fade, you can cry and cry the rest of your life. If you start thinking about tragedies. It's one person says, I'm going to cry. This deserves crying. This deserves not going back to regular life. That's one approach. Another person may argue denial. Time passes, move on, start building, do other things, distract yourself. The Jewish approach is interestingly the most paradoxical. It says both, cry and build. So in that letter that has become recently publicized, a letter written to the mother of the Nifteris, and I honored her by saying her name, Rasha, the daughter of Sarah and Chaimeir. May they have many healthy years and only simchas from their children and grandchildren and so on. So the Rebbe wrote her a letter in 1970, after the tragic passing of her mother at the age of 37, also by the name Rasha, on the second day of Sukkot. And the Rebbe wrote her a letter several months later in the month of Tevis, the 14th of Tevis. I want to just review this letter, and I want to quote a few others as well. And here the Rebbe deals with this paradox. So the letter was written in its original Hebrew, but I'll just read a few sections in the English. The Rebbe speaks, I received your letter on time, meaning it was, when she sent it, she must have sent it right after the tragedy. So those circumstances have delayed my answer, in which you write of the passing of your mother and your thoughts and feelings and connection to this. And the Rebbe begins, as I just pointed out, that in the truth, none of us can understand anything at all. Definitely not God's ways. And it shouldn't surprise us, because God is beyond us all. Using the Rebbe's words, concerning the ways of God, none of us amongst us knows anything at all. Who created humans, directs them, and observes them with the most specific hashgacha pratis, divine providence. But certainly, He is the very essence of good, and as the expression goes, is in the nature of good to do good. If at times what God does is at all not understood by the human mind, little wonder. What significance has a limited, measured, finite creature in relation to the infinite and endless, and especially in relation to the absolutely infinite and endless, as the Rebbe says, the bli gvul ve'ein seif ha'amiti. Putting things into context. This by no means minimizes the pain, but that's how the Rebbe opens up. And then he goes on and says, nevertheless, God chose to reveal a fraction of His wisdom to man, to flesh and blood. This He did with His holy Torah, called the Torah of Light and the Torah of Life. Thus, also in the case of the above-mentioned occurrence, talking about this death, this untimely death, and similar, one can find an understanding, and the Rebbe added in his handwriting, which means in addition to what he initially wrote, he added b'miktsas al kaponim, an understanding, at least a partial one, showing that even after this, it's still just a minuscule explanation in accordance with what is explained in our written and oral Torah. The Rebbe goes on to discuss the contradiction that you find that in mourning and grieving, you have seemingly a contradiction. On one hand, it says one is not allowed to grieve more than 7 days in the Shiva. On the other hand, one is not allowed to grieve less than 7 days. And the Rebbe's words, now if such a case is natural to mourn, what's so terrible about one who mourns more? If a person emotionally wants to grieve and mourn more than 7 days, what's the problem? Why the harsh rebuke mentioned in the law for someone who goes overboard? And if to mourn excessively is so terrible, why is it cruel to mourn less? In other words, how do you monitor and regulate something like this? Either you grieve or you don't grieve. Or you grieve, why only say you can't grieve less than 7 days? And the Rebbe continues in a pretty profound discussion which can be studied, that he brings from the Shem Shulchan Aruch, that brings about this parameters of grieving, that one should fear and worry, search one's deeds, and repent. And then he goes on to explain the two sides of the picture. On one hand, the soul is eternal, And there's no question that death does not affect the soul's continuing journey. You don't need to have brilliant logic for that, because the soul is a spiritual force and it's not affected not by illness and not by death and not by things of flesh and blood. And on the contrary, without the body, it continues to ascend on a higher and higher level. And yet, the cessation of the bond, the death, and how it affects us below is horrible. Because now there's a severing. We are disconnected. So it's true the soul continues its journey, but for those that love that soul, connected to the soul, they no longer can speak to it. They no longer communicate with it. So you have a combination of two realities. One reality that we're told, and one reality that we feel. The reality that we're told is the soul continues on. We believe that. And that's part of some consolation, that it's not over. But the tragedy and the sense of loss is there because we can't see it. So the soul sees us from the other side of the curtain, but we can't see what's going on over there. And hence, you have the two different statements. On one hand, the grieving is profound because we sense and feel this loss and this disconnection. On the other hand, to continue to grieve and forget the fact that the soul continues its journey is equally cruel. Because then what you're doing is defining the soul on your terms. And the Rebbe adds in a personal note, especially for those people who were close to the soul, meaning family members. And he's writing to the mother here, or in this case the daughter. Especially those people, they feel both of these two aspects in an acute fashion. On one hand, they feel the deeper loss because it's so close to them. On the other hand, because it's a soul that's so connected to them, they feel that ongoing journey. And the loss is even more profound because the soul cannot continue doing the mitzvahs and all the things it had to do in this world. But at the same time, there's also a sense of understanding that you cannot be overwhelmed just with grief, and understanding that the soul continues on. The Rebbe then continues and says that in addition, the people here, the children that remain on earth for many long years, have now responsibility to fill the shoes and to continue this journey, being the arms and legs and continuing doing the actions that were inspired in the spirit of that soul. So what you have here is essentially a combination, and not a philosophical one, but a personal one, because the Rebbe himself was a living example of these two forms. Every time the Rebbe suffered a loss, the Frierdiker Rebbe, his mother, his wife, of course his father, every one of these experiences, the Rebbe cried and continued to cry, but did not stop with crying. He cried and he built. He built something that was permanent and that remains a living edifice till this day. Look at the revolution that the Rebbe created with the study of Rashi, all in honor of his mother. So though the loss is still there, and the loss was profoundly felt by the Rebbe, but what continued on was the study of this Rashi. The idea of a birthday the Rebbe instituted after the passing of his wife. And there we as well saw, in 1988, the tragedy. We saw the tears. We saw the Rebbe going through this most vulnerable situation and doing it in a very open, direct way. Why? We don't really know why. I always wondered why in 1988 the Rebbe so openly grieved. In 1965, when the Rebbetzin Chana passed away, it was far more discreet. Perhaps one of the reasons was a Rebbe wanted to show us direction and give us strength and not just tell us words. You saw it living. You saw, I remember, never forget the words the Rebbe spoke at the Shleishim of the Rebbetzin Chaim Mushke. It was Parsha Parah, 30 days after her passing, Chav Bei Shvat, 22nd of Shvat. And the Rebbe said then the following words, speaking about Parsha Parah, talking about Tumas Mes, Parah Aduma, the red heifer. And he said the Medrash, that God showed Moses all the different impurities, and then and showed him how you purify from all these impurities. And then he showed him the impurity of death, tumas mes. And here Moses suddenly froze. Niskarkam upanav shel Moshe. His face turned yellow, green, began to tremble. How will we ever purify from the impurity of death? And then God answered, here is the paraduma, the red heifer. This is the process of how you purify. And the Rebbe asked this incredulous question. And you can see who he was talking about. Not just the Moshe of that time. He said, Chachma de Gedusha, Moshe is Chachma v'Atzilus, is the highest level of wisdom. He didn't know that a soul continues on its journey, and that Yerid Tzedek Chaliyah, every descent brings an ascent, and that within, even in death, there are positives. And you can find that he of all people understood. Just as God gives, God takes. Just as God, the impurity of death, was he shocked and disturbed? How will you purify from the impurity of death? And the Rebbe said, because after all the explanations in Chassidus, and in all the texts, the emotions, the heart bleeds. The heart is hurt. The heart does not understand, does not relate to it. Because at the end of the day, there's a hefsek. Somewhere in this world, there's a break, there's a severing. And Moshe Rabbeinu was not just philosophizing, he was empathizing with death. He was empathizing with every loss that would exist from the beginning of time till the end of time. And as that bothered him, it was very clear that the Rebbe was talking about himself. And I believe this was one of the ways the Rebbe gave strength to all of us. Because when you're dealing with situations that are beyond rational, as we all know what grief can do, well, no one should know, but those that have experienced it, it's beyond rational. You need a force that's also beyond rational. So having the strength of seeing a tzaddik grieve, as sad as it is empowering. And when you read these words, some people say, this sounds like philosophical, justifying. No. You're talking about someone who's experiencing the pain, and yet we are not going to allow ourselves to be paralyzed and continue the loss by losing ourselves. So while the Jews were burying their dead, and God forbid they didn't even bury their dead during the Holocaust, grieving over their dead, they were building with tears in their eyes. Because that's what we do. You cry and you build. And it sounds like a paradox, but life is a paradox. It's not about going into denial, and it's not about being overcome purely by grief. It's taking the grief and channeling it. You're angry, you're upset, you have questions on God, channeling it into a life that is better than ever, to a commitment to goodness and to kindness more than ever before, not to become cynical, and so on. It's a challenge, of course it's a challenge. But it would be a great shame, and a disgrace even, a desecration of a life that was lost prematurely, for us to also lose our lives in despair, in depression, in paralysis, and being immobilized and demoralized. The greatest honor we can do to a soul is to say, I don't understand, I don't know, I cry for you, but I take my tears and I will feed goodness and kindness in your spirit. Things you've done, I will continue to perpetuate. It's not an answer, but it's a direction. And in an interesting way, it's an answer as well. It's not a rational answer, but it's the best answer we can give. And it's the Jewish answer why we're here today, despite all that we've suffered. This does not take away from the pain. This does not necessarily mean that should be said at a shiva call, this whole discussion I'm saying right now. But it's something we have to know in our hearts. And you see people who've suffered, and they're broken, and they cannot move on. We can't judge them. Yet, the best possible response is one where we pick up the pieces with tears. We don't forget, but we channel it. That's what we do as Jews. I want to read another letter. Another letter where someone asked the Rebbe a similar question. As you surely know, the questions you asked, this is a letter from Erev Rosh Chodesh Kislev, Tavshin Lamed Ches. It would be 5738. So we're talking 1977, the end of 1977. The Rebbe writes, as you surely know, the questions you ask regarding God's ways are already found in the Torah's B'Ksav and Torah Shabbal Peh, for they are natural in time of stress. These questions are natural. One general answer, which is really self-evident, though hard to accept in a state of emotional upset, is that it is surely illogical to limit the Creator in his designs and actions to conform to the understanding of a created human being. Again, beginning with that unfathomable. And again, I want to repeat, this is not some type of surrender, or because we're limited alone. This itself is strength. It's connecting to something that's beyond us. That's the key thing we have to remember. And we don't look to rationalize because God could have done it in a different way. Let's always remember that. I've often had the occasion to cite a simple illustration to the effect that no one can expect an infant to understand the ideas and actions of a learned professor. Although the latter was once an infant himself, and the present infant may have the potential to even surpass the professor in due course. How much more so and incomparably when it comes to the infinite intelligence of the Creator, vis-a-vis the finite and limited intelligence of a created human being. This will, of course, not be a revelation to you. Only, as the Torah says, it is difficult for a person to accept consolation in time of grief. But then this is what I wanted to continue with. However, with all due respect, I must say that I was quite and very much indeed astonished at your remark, "Where is my father?" Clearly this was a son who had lost his father. Where is my father? Knowing your family background as well as your husband's and yours, it is surely unnecessary to remind you that the soul is eternal, and moreover, its survival after the death of the body is not something that has to be believed, but it's plain common sense. For obviously physical illness that affects the body cannot affect the soul, which is spiritual. It can only affect and terminate the union of the body and soul, but not the soul itself. Now the Rebbe continues and says, what you need to focus on is how you connect to your father's soul in your life. That when you have this grief, that you have to then translate it into actions that connect you to the soul's continuing journey. So to ask, where's your father? The Rebbe is basically saying, is you are cutting yourself off from him. Yes, it would be nicer and far more blessing in a revealed way that you can connect in a direct fashion. But now the connection has to be a spiritual one. And to cut that off, to deprive yourself of that, is even worse of a tragedy, because then you're also, God forbid, killing off the soul in your mind. But I want to touch upon something even more sensitive. And this is not intellectual as well. It's, again, addressing existence itself. At the end of the day, why Moshe Rabbeinu and why the Rebbe and why the greatest men and women cried over loss, even though they understood God better than we. You know, we could say we're simple human beings, finite human beings, and we just need to have a little solace, a little peace. Why should we have to suffer? But when you see these great men and women, the great tzaddikim, because at the end of the day, what they're crying over is the mere fact that there is death. Because let's be honest, from a Torah point of view, death is an aberration. It's an anomaly. Why should a soul and a body have to be separate? If you think of a cup of water, if there was no evaporation, should the water ever have to seep out of the cup? No need. So why should a soul ever have to leave the body? And a soul is far more than water. It's a divine energy. The answer is because chet etzadas. That's why it says in the Gemara that there are people, the only reason they died was because of chet etzadas. They had no sin of their own. But because that punctured, so to speak, the cup, it punctured the physical reality, not allowing it to be aligned and seamless with the divine and spiritual energy. And that's what we cry over. So of course we cry over the individual loss of a particular person. That goes without saying. But in the big scheme of things, that particular loss is a reflection of all losses. Which leads me to another letter where the Rebbe says, why do we console people? With Menachem, we console people. We say the words that you should be consoled together with the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. What's the connection between the two? Because the loss of every human being is a reflection of the loss of the temple. It's a reflection of the loss of the divine. and it ultimately reflects a disconnect. Death itself is the greatest sin against God. It is the greatest challenge to God's unity. Soul and body are meant to be one. Physical and spiritual are meant to be one. Matter and spirit are meant to be one. Because Hashem Echad is oneness. Death signifies and symbolizes a severing, a duality. A soul in one place, a body in another. A body in the ground, God forbid, and a soul ascending on high. That is the greatest tragedy of all. And in every particular loss, that's what we feel and experience. And again, this doesn't minimize the personalization of it. Because you could say, how come we don't mention the name of the person? You should be consoled for the loss of your child, for the loss of your parent, for the loss of your husband, spouse. In Kaddish that we say, we again do not mention any names. So some skeptics say, what's going on here? Why is it depersonalized? Why don't you speak about the person? Why are you connecting it to events that happened in Zion, Jerusalem, thousands of years ago? In Kaddish, you're exalting God's name. Because if you limit it to the human being, then we're back to bring it down into our little box. And what do we know? Death wakes us up to a reality that is beyond our existence, beyond limited existence. And it also says, I need strength from a place that's far greater than just mortal strength. Of course, we would all love to be with our loved ones all the time. But when, God forbid, someone is taken from us, so it could bring you down to a place that is subhuman, where you get demoralized and depressed, as I mentioned, or it can lift you up to a place of the divine where you recognize there's a mystery to existence. All of existence and death captures the falsity of this world. Alma de Shikra. It captures the severing between spirit and matter and all that's wrong with existence. Now, why do we have to wait for death to remind ourselves? Because this world lives in its own delusion. As the Tzimtzum Arishan explains, as the Arizal explains with his concept of the great concealment, the concealment created an agnostic universe, and we could deceive ourselves into thinking everything is fine. Death suddenly wakes us up. And that's why, in that letter, as I said, from 1970, the Rebbe says, brings it from the Shulchan Aruch, Yifashprish b'maisav, look at yourself, do tshuva. This is not meant to say, look at yourself, your sin caused this death. That doesn't say anywhere. It means that death itself is connected to sin. It's connected to a broken world. So besides the fact that we do not want to betray a soul by just giving in to our own depression, to our own grief, to our own despair, there's another factor here. We want to mend that schism that has brought death into the world in the first place. So the best thing you can possibly do to reconnect to the soul in a body is to do your part to connect spirituality and material in this world through your mitzvahs, through your tshuva, through repairing the cup, to doing whatever you can do to connect again spirit and matter, which ultimately allows for the reconnection of soul and body. So when we speak about Tchias HaMesim, we speak about the resurrection. It's not just meant to be, again, some unrealistic, they dream about resurrection. Someone once told me, they dream about resurrection. It's actually the natural state of affairs is that matter and spirit, body and soul, should be one, as I mentioned before. People ask often, where does the soul go to after death? The very question is based on a certain arrogant assumption. It's the assumption that I know where I am, where it's at, right here, and the soul, where does the soul go to? So I use somewhat of a humorous analogy. I don't know if it's appropriate in the circumstances, but I think it could be said. Imagine an imaginary dialogue between a refrigerator and electricity. And the refrigerator says to the electricity, where do you go when they pull the plug? And the electricity responds to the refrigerator, what kind of chutzpah, what nerve do you have? You're a little box, they just invented you 100, 200 years ago to refrigerate food. So you've learned to contain me, electricity, in a little box, to cool and keep your food fresh. And now you have the nerve to ask me, where do I go? Where'd you come from? You're a newcomer. I go back to where I always was, uncontained by boxes like you, to the place wherever energy is, outside of space, or in some more ethereal space, however you define it. That's where I go. Now apply that to ourselves. So we ask the little box with our myopic vision that barely can see the little world right around us. We ask the question, where does the soul go to? That's the idea. To recognize we're in a small little farm, we're in a small little box. It's an important box. And God wants us to be in this box, as I'll discuss in a moment. But it's like asking that same question, where does the soul go to? You think you know where it's at? We barely can understand life on the surface level. What do we know about this human being that's 5-6 feet tall, 100, 200 pounds? We won't go higher than that. What do we know about this body? What do we know about the brain that's the size of the palm of a hand? A little larger. And we ask the question where a soul goes to. This doesn't mean we're not allowed to ask questions, but you have to also be honest. A little part of a picture, the little box, cannot talk about and understand the soul's expanse. And yet, God sent that soul into the box and said that's the purpose of creation. That's why I want you to do a mitzvah. You can only do it. 1 hour of tshuva, of return, and good deeds in this world is more valuable than chol chai elam haba, than all the life in the world to come, where that soul goes outside of the box, in this box. And there's pain when the soul leaves the box, as in the first letter I was reading. And there's pain, that fact that the soul, not just pain because we're disconnected, but also pain because the soul no longer can continue doing and fulfilling that mission that it was meant to fulfill. So we have both factors going at work here. The pain of the disconnect, but at the same time, we build because we want the connection again. Are we ready to start saying, you know what, I give up because the tragedy is so big, I won't continue to build? Look at Holocaust survivors. They built. Their vengeance, they open up a album. Our vengeance is our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, with tears in their eyes, with all the losses. Because to give in to the grief is basically giving up on the soul that has left us. We want that soul back. We want to connect to it. Connect to it spiritually and connect to it physically. In another letter, the Rebbe writes, this is to children. The Rebbe writes, this is a letter from the 6th of Kislev, Tavshin Lamed, 5730. Again, this would be the end of 1969. I was saddened to hear the passing of your father, Olav Hashalom. I extend to you, to all the bereaved family, my heartfelt sympathy and the traditional expression of condolence. May God comfort you in the midst of the mourners for Zion and Jerusalem. And may you not know of any more sorrow in the future. One way of finding true comfort in such a case is by helping to fill the void which was left by the departed, to the extent that it is possible. To be sure, there can be no full replacement since every person is a world in himself. However, when children add to their usual good deeds a measure of special effort, also on behalf of the departed parent, the good and the eternal, which the deceased practiced in his lifetime is thus continued. And the world is filled to some extent at least. The question arises, if the children's daily life and conduct is as it should be, how can they do more in order to make up for a second person? Since their utmost is in any case expected of them in fulfillment of their own obligations. And the Rebbe continues and shows the infinite potential each of us has. The answer is to be found in the commentary of the Baal Shem Tov on the words, for you will be unto me a desirable earth. Malachi 3:12. Baal Shem Tov explains, every Jew is likened to the earth in which the greatest resources and treasures are hidden. It is only necessary to discover them and bring them to the surface, so they can be put to good use. Similarly, every Jew has hidden resources and capacities which need to be brought to the surface and activities. The discovery of such hidden treasures is made in various ways, among them also through some upheaval or shock in human life, through a shattering experience such as a bereavement, or on the happy side, through an extraordinary, happy and joyous event. At such a time, the individual discovers in himself hidden powers stemming from his innermost self, his very essence, powers of which he may not even have been aware. And the Rebbe continues with the blessing that the children should use those powers. And yet again, another way of phrasing how grief can turn a person into a far greater person. I remember when my father passed away. almost 10 years ago, in 2005. The most traumatic event in my life. And thank God, I cannot say, you don't compare tragedies. Every tragedy has its own quality. And one is, at the end of the day, the finality is the finality, whether it's a person 100 years old or 50 years old, or in my case, my father 70 years old. Obviously, tragedies that leave children and other such abnormal situations are far greater. But again, you can't compare. Personally, it was extremely traumatic. But I took upon myself then a mitzvah, as busy as I was, to continue the newspaper that my father published and edited, the Allgemeiner, completely irrationally. But in a strange way, it gave me power to translate the grief in something that he did. Till this day, it was a healing. Everyone has to be able to find in the grief that they have, the connection they have to their parent. They have to find that soul connection deeper than they would have found without it. Is that why it happened? Absolutely not. As I said a number of times, and I repeat again, we're not here to rationalize. We're here to cry together. But the tears, and the greatest way of redeeming those tears, berina yuktseru. Through the tears, we sow and we plant, and things grow, and you channel them. And that turns the grief into something that's redeemed. And there's no question, as the Rebbe writes in many of these letters, that it adds simcha and joy to the soul as it does its travels. So my friends, at the end of the day, I have no answers for you. We don't have answers, but we have strength. We see people who have grown up and become shining examples despite the challenges. The mother that was sealing Shiva this past week for her daughter Rashi, look at her family. A shining example of what it means to be a Chassidic family, a healthy family, intact, giving, no bitterness, no resentment, no excuses. And yet it came at a heavy price. So we don't understand why God does things. But we see beauty that comes out of it, and you can't deny the beauty. To deny the beauty is, even in some ways, even a worse crime than the death itself. Because what did not die were the good deeds. What did not die, the prices that the mother paid in bringing up such children. What did not die is the commitment, the bittul. They not take themselves so seriously, and they not even take their grief so seriously. I know that sounds like a weird statement, but when you grieve, you have to grieve. But it's not about you. At the end of the day, it's about the mission in your life. And if it becomes all about you, whether it's grief or joy, then it becomes limited to your mortal capacity. The point is to connect to something that's beyond the mortal, which is why I believe it was one of the older Rebbes that said after the Holocaust, I don't want to have an answer from God. Even if he has an answer to give me, I don't want to hear it. The time is to connect to something that is beyond us. This is not a consolation, and it's not a solution, and it doesn't take away the pain, but allows us to be alive and allows us to forge ahead. And that's a critical component in this whole process. Now, what I've said till now is relevant to, I think, both people who are themselves grieving and the rest of us watching, but there's more to be said. In gathering and looking at the many talks that the Rebbe delivered on times of tragedy, one central theme pops out again and again. And that theme is the theme of Achdus, unity. And in one place, the Rebbe actually explains why. I just mentioned death is the ultimate epitome and captures the tragedy of pirud, of separation of matter and spirit, body and soul. What is the best solution? Achdus, unity. I have no question, and I say it with the full, authority, at least with my full ability using these airwaves, that we have to create a revolution. If everything that's happened has touched us so deeply and has shaken us up, remember, time passes. The Rebbe writes in a year after Yud Shvat, he says the summer has passed, the winter has passed, the summer has gone, and as man, time does its thing. Time will pass, which in a way is a blessing because it means we can't continue living with the shock and the grief. But there's also a downside to it. We forget. We move on. If you want to translate and redeem what has happened the last week, last weeks, last months, last year or two to the community, we have to create a revolution that's as powerful as the grief we had when we hit the low point. A revolution in what way? in Achdus. We all are dealing with, come from communities. Our communities have, unfortunately, many times disagreements. Disagreements are understandable, but we have to obliterate the cancer of sinna. I'm not naive. I understand people are going to say, it's unrealistic. But the first step to begin is stop looking at others, look at yourself. It's very interesting. People see a tragedy, they say, that's because this one didn't do that and this one didn't do that. I'd like them to show me a source in the Torah where the Torah says that you point fingers at anybody else. The Rambam in the beginning of the laws of fasting, when he talks about catastrophes that happen, he says when a catastrophe happens, it's cruel, it's achzarius to think of it as mikra, as just a random event. And a person has to look at themselves, like he says in Hilchos Oval, similar words when there's a death. That a person mefashpers b'maisav has to look into their own actions, a soul-searching introspection, cheshbon hanefesh, tshuva. It doesn't say look at someone else. It doesn't say, point fingers, that must be that person's sin. You heard about it. Why are you pointing someone else? Maybe they didn't even hear about it. If you heard about it, you have to look inside yourself. And interestingly, it doesn't say because of your sin, that's why it happened. It says if you know that it happened, it means there's an important message for you to see that period, that break in the world where godliness is concealed in the worst possible way. You have to do something about it. So the first step is Achdus, look at ourselves. Just stop judging others. Everyone should stop judging others. Stop looking at others. Start looking at yourself. What are you doing to bring love into your community? And as they say, you're either part of the problem or part of the solution. And I'm not mincing any words here. I'm not pointing any fingers to anyone. I'm talking to myself. But I'm also saying it because I'm saying it to each of us to look at ourselves. So don't take this as me pointing my finger to anyone out there. I'm looking and pointing my finger at myself. But I think each of us have to do the same thing. All this has affected you. It's shaking you up. Why is it happening? I don't know. But what are you going to do about it? Make a revolution of love. Stop talking negatively at the table about anybody, even with good intentions. Stop talking to other neighbors about everything. Don't be part of them at machlekes. And there's no question we could all do something when we apply ourselves in that fashion. One of the questions I was going to address, and I see time is limited, and I'm sticking to this topic, is community conflicts. This is exactly an opportunity now, a wake-up call to all of us. Community conflicts. How do you deal with it? All communities are made of individuals like you and I. There's no such thing as a machlekes without people involved. So who are these people? You can point at others. But we have to all become embracers of love and kindness, which, by the way, was the spirit both of the Nifteres Rashi, the Shliach Rabbi Minkowicz, the other Shluchim. Their whole commitment was to loving other people. So what a better way to honor that? But even beyond that, the mere fact that we see death, unfortunately, we see a break, we see some type of godliness concealed, we have to do something about it. And what we do is we unite. Stopping with the judgments and stopping with the condescensions and all the other insecurities where we dress up our own flaws, human flaws, in all kinds of holy garments. And everybody can fit the hat as they see fit. That is a universal lesson, a message that the Rebbe offers. But at the same time, we also cry out to heaven. We cry out to heaven. One of the things we say in Yizkor is we cite the heart-wrenching prayer. How could God allow something like this to happen? Where the enemies of God will say, Ayeh Elokechem, where is your God? That's what they'll cry out. Where is your God? They say there's a story was in the Holocaust, during the Holocaust. So obviously the Nazis did their part in torturing Jews, but there was one particular commander who was very was about to kill a Jew. The Jew asked the Nazi, "Can I say a prayer? Can I say something?" Go ahead. He lets him. Last words in his mouth, he begins to pray to God. And the Nazi asks him, "What are you praying for? What are you saying?" He says, "I'm thanking God." He says, "What are you thanking God? Look at you, you're a miserable wretch. You're about to be killed by me. Where's your God? He's not here to protect you." He says, "I'm thanking God for creating me not like you, for not creating me like you." Oh, it's an interesting take on things, because at the end of the day, the soul of this Jew continues on, and he knew if it wouldn't be him, it'll be his children. If it not be his children, it'll be his grandchildren. But we cry out to God at the same time. How could you allow people who are cynics, feed them questions, innocent children, having to sit shiva for their mother, having to now build lives without a mother in their presence? And I go back to the words of the Rebbe himself, one of the sadder talks the Rebbe gave just 2 weeks before he had a stroke. The sikha, the talk he gave on the 9th, ironically, is the night of 9th, 10th of Adar, which is the night when the shlucha of Alpharetta, Rashi, passed away. 22 years ago, last week, a week ago, the Rebbe spoke. It was the end of the shiva for Mrs. Lapine, who was tragically murdered in her own home here in Crown Heights. And the Rebbe began the words and said things that you don't usually hear. But I think it's important to take note as well, because you see how the Rebbe speaks, and when the Rebbe speaks, even the sad words also give us strength in a strange way. And basically the Rebbe said that though it's not Peschim Bebracha, we don't open up with a blessing, it's Zman Grama. He starts speaking about a woman who gave her life, Kiddush Hashem, all that know the circumstances. She gave her life, not to be desecrated, and she gave her life. And the Rebbe speaks about the Mesiras Nefesh of a mother whose children will be asking, where's my mother? And one day they'll have to tell their children that we didn't have a mother, looking for their mother. And the Mesiras Nefesh of a mother is far greater of her own, is to give up her children to the care of others. There's nothing more terrible for a mother. And yet that's what she did. And the Rebbe said, so we have questions. How did such a thing happen, the Rebbe said? How did such a thing happen in a community where the Rebbe said, my father-in-law, the Bais Meshulish, which is the Bais of Teira, Vedi Mills Chasadim of the Friedrich Rebbe. And we could add a Bais, not just 10 years of the Friedrich Rebbe, but all the decades of the Rebbe's work here. How does such a thing happen? That's what the Rebbe said. And I said, I tried everything. I tried doubling Simcha. We should add 2 months of Simcha Adar. I tried everything. How did such a thing happen? And then the Rebbe said words that rarely were ever spoken by the Rebbe. He says, so what's going to help me? What's going to help you if I have with questions? Maybe there's some people here that know a little more than me. Maybe some people here that know a little less than me. But how is it going to help us all to have questions? And then the Rebbe stops himself. He starts saying, the ancient, maybe, and then refuses to even try to rationalize it. And then he uses the words from Kehelis, chapter 5 in the beginning. Words, again, rarely used by the Rebbe, that better to keep words, dvarim mu'atim, better not to speak. God can take care of himself. The Rebbe refused to try to rationalize it. They refused to, and then realized they didn't want to criticize God. But that's what was going on. What more can we do? And I thought about this talk many times. I listened to it again just this past week. Because you can listen to it now. It's literally like we've been spoken today about the latest events. And it's a Rebbe speaking, the same Rebbe that gave us strength in Maimarim and Sichos through the years. So there's every word is measured. Every word is divine. Because there is also the understanding that there are things that are simply not for us to understand. And asking a question and crying about it itself is also a statement. And the Rebbe said it. Maybe only once. But there are times, sometimes you have to acknowledge that we're vulnerable creatures and that we do not have answers. And we've tried everything possible. And that itself is a statement. And in a strange way, that can also give power. Because it's acknowledging the sheer absurdity of existence, the sheer absurdity of life, the sheer absurdity of Fiful Zasher. How much is a limit? Like the Tzemach Tzedek that I quoted before said, he's Kol Yochel at the end of the day, with all the explanations. Yes, it says in Tanya that in the Yisurim, in the oppression and in the death and in the most negative things, there's deeper good. And it says in Perek chapter 26 in Tanya that when a person recognizes that, he can reveal it, and when Mashiach comes, you'll see that revealed good. In Igeres HaKedesh, he says that in one place he says that through showing that you do not succumb to it, and you continue to love God, you evoke loves God even today. But that too requires work. And then another place in Igeres HaKedesh 11, what I just said was from 21 Igeres HaKedesh, he says that it's an assignment, it's a test. And as soon as you show that you overcome the test, the good is revealed. And the Rebbe says in the famous Sikha, Bahar B'Chukesai, Tovshin Tez Zayin, Lag Ba'imr Sikha, and Tovshin Tez Zayin, It's printed the last sikh in the volume 1 of the Likutei Sichos. He says, and then there's a fourth level, Rashbi. Through Primis HaTeira reveals the good right away. And all that is still not sufficient. Because all that is still, we're revealing good. At the end of the day, God doesn't have to do it this way. And if it had to happen once in history. We're already thousands of years of Golus, 2,000 years almost. And it still has to happen. So that last statement of the Rebbe, that Tesod, the Tavshinun Beis, was not a statement some people saw it almost as yush, God forbid, despair. Chaz v'shalom. Same shchina medaberes meteir grene. You have to say the Rebbe did not want to give it any credibility with giving any one explanation, saying maybe we still have to do one more thing. He didn't even say Achdus and Avis Yisrael. He didn't even say that this is a sign we still have one step to do. He didn't want to give it any credibility. You know why? Because we've suffered enough. We don't need another explanation. And wanted to demonstrate the absurdity. At the end of the day, the Tzimtzum Arishan has already done its job. We've had enough concealments. We had enough redemptions. We've had Siman Perek Chavav of Tanya dealt with. We've had Siman Yud Aleph, Siman Chaf Aleph, etc., etc. So the Rebbe didn't want to give any credibility. At some point, there has to be a protest and says, it's a pure question. And we don't have an answer, and we're not looking. And that's why the Rebbe quoted the Kehelis, that to be careful to what we speak, because the Rebbe was putting himself on the line in a way. If you look in Kehelis, you know what it says there? God is in heaven, you're on earth. Be careful what you say about God. And yet the Rebbe quoted it, and at the same time, in a way, spoke to God in that fashion. 2 weeks later was the stroke. I'm not suggesting it's connected, but it's connected in one way. What lesson it leaves to us is there comes a point where we already have redeemed all these darknesses. Now comes a point we are not ready to look for explanations. We're ready to say this is part of absurdity. Enough is enough. We do not understand. We have questions. And yet we forge ahead. There's a talk that the Rebbe once delivered in the early 8 Mems. I don't recall exactly when it was. Someone knows when it was, please send me a note. Where the Rebbe spoke of the Medrash that when the temple was destroyed, and it was compared to God going like a Baal Holach l'Medina Sayam, a husband who abandoned his wife and went off on a trip, Medina Sayam. And that's Golus. God is concealed. And Medrash says when Mashiach comes, the wife, Knesset Israel, will still be waiting for God. And God will be shocked by the presence that his wife has waited for him almost 2,000 years. Who would wait after 2,000 years? But that's the loyalty. That's the dedication to goodness and to life. I don't know if one can say this, but in a way it's like a dedication in a more revealed way that Jews showed more revealed love to God. Sometimes how God reveals to us. Reveals. Obviously there's a hidden good. And the mere fact that we're here as a Jewish nation is the greatest chesed of God. And one should be very careful because no matter what we've gone through, we're still here to talk about it. But the Jews did their part. We remain maybe limping, wounded, scarred, but we're here to talk about it and to tell the tale. I know one thing. When you look in the talks of the Rebbe, especially the early years, Tafshin Yud, you hear the Rebbe crying at the end of Basiligani. You hear the Rebbe crying in the Sichos of the first years and then later as well, but especially those first years. You hear crying and building. You hear the essence of what Yiddishkeit is and what Chassidus is all about. We suffer greatly, but we have not become sufferers. We will refuse to become victims, even to our own despair, to our own grief. Our forging ahead through the tears is a sign of our resilience, of our strength. No matter what happens, nothing can kill us. Not our spirits, not our willpower. Yes, the Nisayon is great. It's a great test because it weakens us. It challenges our faith. It challenges so many different parts of us. It makes it very easy for the Yetzer Hara to come and say, be cynical, be apathetic. What difference does it make? Look, great people are being taken. But it also allows us to shine because crisis and difficult times bring out the worst in people and bring out the best in people. And if we really want to create a revolution, if we really want to redeem all this, we have to create a revolution that makes it to say, I can't say it was worth it, but you can say, at least I'm doing something that is as powerful as the negative. And that's what ultimately what it comes down to. We should not allow ourselves to betray not our souls, not the souls of the great people, men and women that have been taken from us recently, and that we can be able to say to them and to us and to our children, here's what we did in time of crisis. We cried, we picked ourselves up, and we continued to build. And we built something greater with the grief than we did without the grief. And that's not what we were waiting for. It's not an explanation. It's how we move forward in times like this. This is a summation, to the best of my ability, at least in this hour, to capture some of the Rebbe spirit and the Chassidus in general, Torah overall, of how we deal with challenges of this nature, crisis, grief, tragedy. Above all, I want to conclude with saying a bracha to anyone who has suffered, that God should fulfill the void in more abundance than ever. And like he says in the Eira Torah, he should have rachmanis on the children that have Yisurim, because he's a kol yochel. It doesn't have to be that way. It could be without the Yisurim. It could be without the pain. Let him give us the light without the darkness. At the same time, we will not lie down and die from it. We will not allow ourselves to create a second death, a second Holocaust, a second tragedy. We'll take our lives and we'll build, and that itself becomes a keli, a container for the greatest blessings. And God should give many healthy and long years to children, to parents, to husband, to spouses, to all of those that have in any way lost it, whether it's a parent, a child, a spouse, a friend, a mentor. We all have different connections to these individuals. And of course this goes not just for those that we know, but for those that are suffering right now that we're not aware of. Because at the end of the day, every death is a break. Every one is a schism. Every one is a reflection, a reminder of the great schism of the big Tzimtzum Arishan that brought death in the first place. And we're looking to do everything possible to repair those last cracks, so then we can be reunited with these souls, with the souls of the great tzaddikim, the Rebbe himself, all the great chassidim, all the prices they've paid will be redeemed, and we will be able to say, Eitcha Hashem ke'anaftabi, that we acknowledge God for even the oppression. Not that we're justifying it, but we ultimately can acknowledge it because at the end of the day, when it all is redeemed and everything is reunited once again into a union of body and soul on this earth, in some way we can celebrate in ways that we would never have been able to celebrate. People live forever, it's a great thing. But imagine reuniting with people that you've missed for a long time. The reunion can be even more celebration than if you had them all the time, which we often take for granted. But we shouldn't have to rely on these type of challenges. God should bless us all, and bless especially those that are weeping the most, to have the greatest joy in their lives and find some type of solace, and be able to lead their children to the chuppahs and marriage, and have children and continue to march forward until we reunited very immediately with our loved ones. Bias Mashiach Tzidkenu b'mheirav yameinu mamish. It should happen immediately now. Thank you. You've been listening to MyLife, Chassidus Applied, episode 10. Next week, Sunday, 8 p.m., will be the next episode, episode 11. Thank you for listening.